Welcome to the Hillsdale Online Courses Podcast. I'm Kyle.
And I'm Juan, and we're back today with Lecture 6 of our Online Courses podcast on the Second World Wars. And today's lecture is on people.
For me, and I think for many people, the most fascinating part of this conflict are the people involved. And it just so happens that some of the most recognizable and colorful characters in human history are at the very center of this conflict. I'm thinking of Churchill, FDR, Stalin, Hitler, Mussolini, Patton, Rommel, Nimitz, and that's just to name a few. And what Dr. Hanson does in this lecture is he grapples with the different ways that these leaders approach the war and the consequences that it has for the people that live in their countries. And I think, at least for me, Juan, the most interesting part is to consider in any conflict this large is how much was it actually being directed by these leaders? You know, were they able to control the circumstances, or were they victims of circumstances, conditions that were outside their control?
And you mentioned the people that they were leading, and one of the things that this lecture will go into as well is the effects on those people, which is, you know, over the course of the war, over 65 million people died. And in most wars, you know, usually soldiers are the biggest number of casualties in a war. In World War II, it was actually the opposite. 75% of the people killed were civilians, and actually 80% of the people who died were on the winning side, mostly the Soviet side.
And yes, so the way in which the Soviet leaders viewed human beings had a lot to do with those statistics that you mentioned, Juan. And so Dr. Hanson in this lecture is going to explain the very different character of the many leaders in World War II, how they approached the war, and the consequences that it had for the people that lived in their countries.
Before we begin today's lecture, I just want to invite you to our website, hillsdale.edu/course. We have 40 courses there that you can choose from, including this course, The Second World Wars. And you can sign up for free. All you need is your email address. Again, that's hillsdale.edu/course. You'll find other resources there, such as readings and a discussion board where you can join other learners and discuss the things that you are learning. So that's hillsdale.edu/course. And now, Dr. Hanson.
In our last lecture, we talked about fire, the use of artillery and tanks in the Second World War. Now let's turn to the people. And I mean people in the broadest sense of both the living and the dead that participated in the war, suffered, and survived it. One thing to remember about World War II is that of all human catastrophes, it was the most grievous. 65 million people died, and that number keeps accelerating or increasing as we get more information, largely from Russia and China, where those were the two great bloodbaths, the bloody landscapes of World War II. Why were there so many people killed? And there's a variety of reasons for that. One is that when World War II broke out in 1939, the world was almost 2 billion people. So we had never seen a conflict take place at a time when the world population was so large. Second reason was it was truly a global war. In other words, people had the technology to communicate, to navigate, to travel, not just within Europe, but to Africa, to Asia, to the so-called New World of North and South America. So more people participated at a time when the world population was the greatest. Thirdly, it was, again, a Western war. As is the case with the First World War, the war breaks out in Europe and it spreads to Asia, but that means that Western technology, planes, bombs, ships, will be characteristic throughout the war. If this was a war in South America, or this was a war in Africa, or this war had broken out in China, it probably would not have spread to Europe or North America, and if it did, it wouldn't have spread with the same lethality. So it was sort of the culmination of the devastating practice of Western warfare. There was another reason as well, and that was in history, there's always a tense relationship between the offensive and the defensive. Think of catapults versus city walls, or crossbow bolts trying to penetrate the armor of mailed knights. And in the 20th century, we went into a phase of the offensive gaining advantage over the defensive. By that I mean the machine gunner or the assault weapon or the mortar could attack an individual soldier that did not have Kevlar, or he did not have body armor as we see today. Or when planes went up in the air, there were not sophisticated surface-to-air missile anti-aircraft batteries as there is today. So the defensive arts were retarded, so to speak, in the 20th century. They were not as sophisticated, and that gave the offensive arts a greater propensity to kill. There's a couple of other reasons. Fascism, Nazism, militarism had created a new ideology, and it was sort of a mixture of state planning and social Darwinism and racism. And so it established the idea that certain people were better than the others, and the others were a drag on the pure race in Italy, the Raza, or the Übermenschen in Germany, or Yamato in Japan. And that justified the idea that you could kill civilians with impunity. In fact, you should kill them to sort of distill and clarify who was the master race, which would be defined by the ability to subject others to an enormous amount of coercion, and then they would serve you or they would be killed. That was a kind of a new concept, at least on this broad scale. There was a final reason why World War II was so lethal, and that can be seen in the two areas where the most people died. The Eastern Front in Russia and the Eastern Front, so to speak, in China. And the way to look at it is a very sophisticated, technologically adept force, the German army, went into areas that did not have adequate defensive mechanisms, especially in 1941, and they went in with the idea that they could kill civilians with impunity. And the same was true of the Japanese army in China. So when you add the 27 million Russians, civilians and combatants that perished, as well as the 15 million Chinese civilians that perished, we pretty much have the second and third largest death tolls of any war. So the way to envision it is, here's World War II, the most lethal conflict in history, and the second most lethal conflict is the Eastern Front, and maybe the third or fourth most lethal conflict in history is the Chinese theater. And that explains why we have so many killed. There's a certain artifacts about that number of dead that are quite disturbing. In most wars, more soldiers die than civilians. In most wars, the victors don't suffer as many casualties as the defeated. That wasn't true in World War II. Of the 65 million killed, perhaps 75% were civilians. And of the winners and losers, perhaps 80% of those who perished were on the winning side. Now, how is that possible when we think that the United Kingdom only lost perhaps 400,000, the United States lost only about 450,000, 0.3% of its population? And the answer to that is, again, to go to China and Russia and understand that the Japanese army was intent on killing Chinese civilians, as was the German army killing Russian civilians. Pause for a moment and then recalibrate what World War II was in some sense. It was largely a story of German and Japanese soldiers butchering Russians and Chinese out of uniform in pursuit of a losing cause. That's quite ironic, but it's important to frame that proposition at the very beginning of any discussion of the casualties and losses of World War II for primarily this reason. 75 years after World War II, we have this revisionism that Dresden or Hamburg bombing campaigns, or the March 9th and 10th fire raid on Tokyo, or Hiroshima and Nagasaki stand as crimes against humanities and were especially lethal. That's often promulgated by Japanese and German scholars. In fact, what is unspoken is that the Japanese and German armies were killing machines. And while Germany suffered 5 million dead, 3.5 million of them soldiers, they killed 27 million people in Russia. And while Japan lost 3 to 4 million, perhaps 1.7 million combatants, they butchered over 15 million people in China and another 4 or 5 million in the Pacific and in Southeast Asia. Translated again, that means that the Germans and the Japanese, in terms of how many people their war machines killed versus how many people they lost, were the most efficient and deadly killing machines of the entire war, and that fact permeates any discussion of World War II. Let's look at the losses per nation. Who were the people who suffered, and when did they suffer, and where did they suffer? The United States and the United Kingdom had great advantages in World War II because they were separated from the main continental theaters of battle. The British by the English Channel, the United States by the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. What that meant was that almost no Axis military forces could reach the 135 million in the United States. There were a few balloons that were sent from Japan on the jet stream with explosives. A Japanese submarine might have lobbed a few shells near Santa Barbara, but there were German subs off the coast of the United States East Coast, but by and large, nobody was killed as a civilian inside the United States. For all the lethality of the Blitz against Britain in 1939 and 40 and the devastating use of V-1 and V-2 rockets, about 50,000 British civilians died. It was a terrible toll, but not comparable to the 27 million Russians and 15 million Chinese. So the United States and Britain came off pretty well as far as civilian casualties, almost in comparison to elsewhere, almost we could say tolerable or moderate. As far as their fighting forces, they had learned the lessons of World War I think, the most astutely. They understood that the British Army and the American Army did not want to get tied down on the continent against the German Army, where German supply lines were proximate and Germany knew the weather, the geography, the location, and it had this illustrious military tradition. It was very lethal, its army and its armor. So from the outset, especially after Dunkirk, the British invested heavily in air and naval power, in amphibious forces, and they attacked the periphery of the Axis. And the same was true of the United States by going into North Africa first, Sicily, Italy, B-17 and B-24 bombing from British bases and into the Mediterranean, especially in Italy. So the idea of the Anglo-Americans was no more World War I, no more slogging in the trenches, but tapping this Axis shell with numerous hits, and at some point it will fracture, especially because there's an ongoing war on the Eastern Front in which 2 out of 3 German soldiers are ultimately going to perish. That strategy meant that the United States and the British came off pretty well in terms of losing both combatants and civilians. When we look to the Russians, just the opposite is true. The fatal error that Joseph Stalin made as he negotiated a non-aggression pact in August 23 of 1939 with Adolf Hitler, the so-called Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and that allowed Russia to let down its guard, transfer strategic materials, about 25% of German war needs in 1939, 1940, and half of 1941, and it unleashed an expeditionary army of 4 million people, 3 million Germans, and then Spanish, Italians, Finns, Romanians, Hungarians, etc. And out of that disastrous decision, the Soviet Union then was naked, and at this time Britain was not able to supply it very well. The United States was not in the war. It lost 4 million the first year, another 3 million the second year of the invasion. And the Soviet Union's role in World War II would be largely a victim of German aggression both civilian and military casualties. And probably somewhere around 9 to 11 million Russian soldiers died, and 15 to 16 million Russian civilians died. Besides the three major allies, there's some other facts about the dead that we sometimes forget. Poland, a country that was not an active combatant for more than about 3 weeks in September of 1939, suffered about 3.5 million dead. In fact, in terms of the total population, along with Yugoslavia, which suffered over 1 million dead, probably the Poles and the Yugoslavians suffered the highest percentage of their population lost in World War II. But unfortunately for Poland, it became the locus of the death camps, places at Auschwitz or Treblinka. And 6 million Jews, political dissidents, communists, gypsies, homosexuals, but primarily Jews, were wiped out in World War II, and they were wiped out in Poland. And the majority of them, not all of them, but the majority of them were Polish citizens. In addition, Poland suffered this age-old fate of being juxtaposed by Russia to the east and Germany to the west. So when the war broke out, they were invaded nearly simultaneously, first by Germany and then a few weeks later by the Soviet Union. And so they had a double whammy, and over 1 million Polish people died outside of the death camps. So it had an unfortunate fate. When we turn to the Axis powers, Italy came off pretty well, if I could say well, in terms of losing 500,000 dead. And that was simply a fact that Italian armies in North Africa, in the Balkans, in Greece, were either bailed out by Germans, or when they were not efficiently bailed out or too belatedly bailed out, they surrendered en masse. And unfortunately, for the Germans, when the Italians surrendered, the Germans were left with the primary responsibility of winning the war in Greece or winning the war in North Africa. And fortunately for the Italians, they didn't surrender to Germans or Japanese. That was always a dangerous thing to do in World War II. They surrendered to Americans. There's a poignant anecdote that American soldiers saw in North Africa, Italians being marched to transport ships, and they were sort of lamenting their fate, and an Italian soldier yelled back at them, "We're lucky we get to go to the United States. You've got to go to Italy next and fight Germans." And that was very true. And the second thing that mitigated casualties in Italy were simply the fact that it surrendered in summer of 1943, and although it became a battlefield of Germans versus British versus Germans versus Americans, Italians versus Italians, and it was a cauldron of a bloodbath. It meant that it was never really occupied after the war. People had felt they suffered enough. Mussolini was deposed, and so in the middle of the war, there were enough Italians that could switch sides and be on the American winning side, so they didn't suffer as many casualties as Germany or Japan. Germany suffered about 1.5 million civilian casualties, and that was largely a result of the American bombing campaign from 1942, but especially in 1943 to 45. Cities such as Hamburg or Cologne or Dresden suffered enormous casualties. And then the fact that from about March 1945 till May 1945, the locus of fighting on the Western Front, and from about February, March of 1945 till May on the Eastern Front, the locus was inside Germany and civilians were in the way. And for example, probably 100,000 German men, women, and children out of uniform perished during the siege of Berlin in April and May of 1945. But in the long term, Germany, it's pretty amazing that a country of 80 million people, Greater Germany, the Reich, that started the war, suffered about 5 or 5.5 million. And you would think that it would be much higher given that the vengeance and the revenge motive of the United States and the United Kingdom and the Soviet Union. But that was not to be true. People blamed Hitler, and then as the war started to end, the German civilians and even the German military started to make the argument they were fighting for Germans and they were not fighting for Nazism. And then after the war, it was sort of pointing fingers at people. They did it, not us. In terms of the Japanese, it's pretty remarkable that a country that was so savage and so lethal in killing Laotians and Vietnamese and Cambodians and Indonesians, Australians, Malayans, Filipinos, especially Chinese, suffered only 3.5 million out of a population of 73 or 74 million. That's primarily a reason, the reason for that is primarily that the Japanese mainland was never invaded and it was never heavily bombed until March of 1945. So let's put that in perspective. Japan goes in a second time into the Chinese mainland in 1937. It is free from major resistance from Western powers for the 37, 38, 39, 40, for most of 41. Then when World War II breaks out in the Pacific, it's largely a fight for the first 2 years between the Japanese Navy and Air Force and the US Navy and Marines. And when it starts to get especially violent in places like Okinawa and Iwo Jima, they're not continental landscapes, they're confined islands, they're not places where you can put huge amounts of people or vast armies. And then when it becomes a question of invading Japan, or at least continuing the fire raids in a way that seems almost unthinkable from proximate bases in Okinawa with bombers transferred from the closed out European theater, the 2 bombs are dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the war abruptly ends. So Japan, ironically, never experiences the type of Holocaust that it perpetuated in China, and it's never really fought over in the way that Germany or Italy is or the Soviet Union. And that explains why the Japanese military machine is so lethal in killing people, and yet very few people are dying. One other aspect of the Japanese military that we're very careful to sort of walk around, but in terms of actual casualties, the Japanese military was only able to kill about 1 Allied soldier for every 20 it lost, but it was able to kill about 10 civilians to every Japanese civilian that was lost. And translated or reduced down to a bitter fundamental truth is Japanese were very poor soldiers in terms of killing enemy soldiers in a fair fight, and they were very adept soldiers in killing civilians in a very unfair fight.
Hillsdale College is a small, Christian, classical liberal arts college that operates independently of government funding, and we want you or your son or daughter to apply. At Hillsdale, students grow in heart and mind by studying timeless truths in a supportive community dedicated to the highest things. Hillsdale College costs significantly less than other nationally ranked private liberal arts colleges and receives regular recognition as a best value, and nearly all students receive financial aid. Our robust core curriculum, vibrant student life, and 8-to-1 student-to-faculty ratio make for an education like no other. For more information or to fill out an application, visit hillsdale.edu/info. That's hillsdale.edu/info.
Let's move, though, to people in the sense of the living, the people who actually made the decisions that resulted in victory or defeat. In terms of supreme command, the Allies were very lucky because had the war broken out when Stanley Baldwin was prime minister, I think Britain would have not done very well at all. It broke out when Neville Chamberlain was prime minister, but quickly he began to bring people in the cabinet who advised him, corrected him, educated him about what was going on. He still felt that there was some chance of a negotiated peace after the fall of France, but on May 10th, 1940, the day that Germany invaded France, there was a radical change of government. Winston Churchill came in, and the Baldwin, Chamberlain, Clement Attlee, Lord Halifax wing went out. And Churchill was determined to not surrender, not negotiate, but not only fight the Germans and the Italians, but defeat them. Now, this was a very strange idea because within 3 weeks there would just be Britain and there would be all of occupied Europe, and there would be a colluding Soviet Union that was supplying gas and food and strategic materials to the Wehrmacht that was bombing Britain. So essentially the Soviet Union was on the side of Germany and Italy. And Japan was starting to become very bellicose, and the United States was isolationist. So what was in the mind of Winston Churchill? Why did he think that he could afford not to negotiate? Hitler had offered him a deal where he said, we will not invade or bomb you, and we will let you have your empire, just call off the war. And then Hitler thought that he would turn his attention then without a worry over either Britain or the United States, and he could turn his attention to the Soviet Union. But Churchill was not just a romantic. He was a very brilliant guy who had been First Lord of the Admiralty. He'd had important post in World War I. In the pre-World War II period in the 1930s, he'd studied military affairs closely. He had traveled to the United States, he traveled to Europe, and he was convinced that the last-minute armament of the Royal Air Force, given the fact that the Royal Navy was the largest navy in the world, meant if everybody took a deep breath, they said to themselves, for all of Germany's continental ground power, land forces, they cannot get across the channel because the British Navy will sink ships from the German Navy, and they do not have the ability to achieve air superiority over Britain, and therefore they can't attack us. And Churchill said, well, you know what, we can't invade either, so there's going to be a standoff. And that standoff is going to favor us, because eventually authoritarians like Hitler and Stalin cannot trust each other. They'll have a falling out. And at some point, they will fight each other, and that will be to our advantage. And at some point, we understand that either the Japanese or the Germans or the Italians will do something stupid and draw the United States into the war. So Churchill was already envisioning an alliance that was to happen a year and a half later of the Soviet Union, the United States, and the British Empire against the Axis triad, and they would have enormous advantages in terms of manpower, population, industrial strength, and geography. And that's exactly what happened. But without Winston Churchill at the helm in that critical period during the last gasps of France in May and June of 1940, I don't think the United Kingdom would have survived. And as far as British military leadership, Churchill was pretty good in picking warlords at both the strategic and tactical level. So men like Alan Brooke, Lord Alan Brooke, Bernard Montgomery, Dowding as an air marshal. People like that were very astute, and they had on their mind one central rationale. The British are outnumbered, and the British industry is pitted against all of Europe under German occupation. So what we must do is keep pressure on the Axis, especially the weaker Italian partner, but we cannot repeat Dunkirk. Now, sometimes they got caught at Singapore or Tobruk, but by and large, the British Army, after Dunkirk, did not make catastrophic mistakes. And that was to their great credit. In other words, they were determined to fight World War II in a way they had not fought World War I, and they were very successful at that. In America, it's hard to think how we would have been prepared for Pearl Harbor without Franklin Roosevelt. By that I mean the Republican Party was primarily isolationist, and the Democratic Party was focused on the Great Depression. Remember that although the Depression had started in 1929, we'd had a second depression in late 37 and 38. And so at this time, people were saying we cannot invest in military expenses and armies and navies and air forces. FDR, along with a brilliant Congressman, Carl Vinson, thought otherwise. He had been Assistant Secretary of the Navy in the Wilson administration. And FDR understood that wherever we were going to fight, Pacific or European theaters, we needed a Navy to transport soldiers over there and to protect them from coming over here. So in a series of naval acts in the late 1930s, the Carl Vinson Naval Act 1, 2, 3, and et cetera, we had on the books a new Pacific fleet about 5 times larger than was at Pearl Harbor and much better, characterized by Baltimore heavy cruisers, Essex carriers, the Iowa-class battleships. That was already on the books. It was already budgeted before we went into World War II. The Lend-Lease project was already in effect, and it would accelerate for both Britain, of which we provided 20% of its strategic materials and total military expenses, and about 25 to 30% of the Soviet Union. And FDR, in sometimes cagey Machiavellian fashion, was reassuring an isolationist nation in 1940 that it would not go to war, even though he was taking quite dramatic steps to prepare it to go to war and might even welcome it going to war. Every leader has shortcomings. In the terms of Winston Churchill, he still believed that the British Empire would emerge preeminent from World War II, and so he tended to focus on India or Malaya or Burma or the Middle East in terms of and North African places like Egypt or East Africa. These are places that are always going to be British, and the war won't change it, and we have to make sure that we have enough troops in Burma, or that we can protect India, or we can protect Suez, because the empire is going to be an integrated whole after the war. And sometimes that clouded his strategic judgment. For example, he thought that he could defend Singapore with battleships, or he thought that he could go up the underbelly of Italy rather than go on the continent and then save British lives, or he thought that he didn't want to divert bombers to submarine campaigns. He did a lot of decisions that were questionable, but I think ultimately can be attributed to this idea that he was not going to repeat World War I. He was going to protect the British Empire at all stages and at all considerations. FDR made a lot of strategic mistakes. One of them is, of course, that he felt that the war was inevitable in the Pacific. He moved the headquarters of the 7th Fleet in January of 1941 from San Diego to Pearl Harbor, but he didn't have adequate precautions or assets to ensure that they could stop the Japanese if it were to be attacked. And that was pretty naive. In other words, Roosevelt became provocative vis-a-vis the Japanese at a time when his naval, Air Force, and Army strength had not been fully mobilized, and that was quite naive. There was an impression also among the American military strategists and FDR himself that they could repeat the formula of World War I. Remember, in April of 1917, we transmitted 2 million American soldiers in just a year and a half by November 1918 and landed them on the continent. And they were the final push that allowed an exhausted British Expeditionary Force and the French to prevail over the Kaiser's armies. But that wasn't going to happen in World War II because there was no Allied presence on the coast of France. But FDR, George Marshall, especially the American Army, felt, you know what, we can just get into the war after Pearl Harbor, send a bunch of doughboys, and we're going to invade France. That would have been an absolute bloodbath. And it took all of Winston Churchill and the British High Command's rhetorical powers to convince the Americans, do not go in 42 on the continent, do not go into 43, do not go into early 44. And they were opposed going in June of 44. But I think history records that the Americans were wrong on that propensity to want to hit the German army head on when they were ill prepared. When we look at the third member of the Allied triad, Joseph Stalin, in some ways, he made the greatest blunders of World War II. The first, of course, was trusting Hitler, letting down his defenses, supplying the Third Reich on the mistaken idea that, as in World War I, the indomitable French army would stand up to the Third Reich. Britain would be very successful, maybe even America would come in early, and these capitalist powers would wear each other out, while the Soviet Union sort of laughed and stood off and then picked clean the carcass of Europe. That didn't happen. Stalin was just shocked that the Germans that he so well supplied were so successful in destroying the Western democracies. He wanted them destroyed, but he wanted a long, enervating war between them and Germany. That didn't happen. And he'd always had a buffer of Eastern European states, but now he looked at this monster he had created under the Non-Aggression Pact, and he said, oh my gosh, when we cut up Poland, now the Red Army is right next to the Wehrmacht, and the Eastern European buffer zone of Hungary or the Baltic states or Czechoslovakia or Poland, they're all German-controlled or sympathetic to the Germans, and now we have the Third Reich right on our borders. Then secondly, he was very naive, despite getting warnings well in advance that on June 21st, Hitler was going to invade the Soviet Union, and not just invade it, but would invade it with the largest expeditionary force in the history of warfare. And that happened to the complete surprise of Stalin, who dismissed all warnings. Richard Sorge, a Soviet agent in the Japanese embassy in Tokyo, warned him, gave him pretty much a blueprint of what the Germans were going to do. And the result was Stalin was utterly unprepared for late June and July of 1941. He was responsible for 4 million people being killed in the Red Army and for 50 million people being occupied by the German army and losing over 1 million square miles of territory. And then third, like Hitler in 1944 and 1945, a beleaguered Stalin sent out an order that there will be no retreat, no tactical maneuvering to the rear. You're going to stand and fight, and that was sort of heaven for brilliant panzer commanders like Hans Guderian or von Rundstedt or von Lieb, who just simply circled around at Kiev and Bryansk, static Soviet armies. So there were envelopments in 1941 that had never been seen in the history of military conflict. 650,000 outside of Kiev, 660,000 or so on the way to Moscow. And that was directly attributed to Joseph Stalin. In his defense, unlike Hitler, he learned. So by 1942 and 43, he was relying on brilliant Soviet commanders like Konev and Zhukov, who were making tactical retreats or were focusing areas of the offensive rather than, in particular locales, rather than trying to go on the offensive all down a 1,500-mile front. When we look at Stalin, though, he had innate cunning. He made a deal with the Germans and by extension with the Italians in 1941. He made a deal with the Japanese, a non-aggression pact in April of 1941. He would later make a deal, as we all know, after the invasion with the Americans and the British in 1941. He would eventually break all of his his promises, or at least most of them, to the British and the Americans. And then ironically, he kept his word with the Germans, with the Italians, and except until the last 2 weeks of the war with the Japanese. So he was more respectful, or at least mindful of Axis sympathies that were killing 27 million of his population than he was of his word with British and American allies, especially after the war, at least in the last stages of the war in 1945. When we turn to the German side, the human side, if we could use that oxymoron in a context of fascism and Nazism, both Hitler and Mussolini, almost alone of all supreme warlords in World War II, Roosevelt, Stalin, Tojo, had fought in World War I. Churchill, after the debacle at Gallipoli, very bravely had gone out into the trenches, but as a senior officer, he was in peril, he suffered terribly, but he was a senior officer. Hitler as a corporal and Mussolini as a corporal who had fought on the Northern Front in Italy against the Austrians were genuine war veterans, and they were in some ways heroic, and they had been wounded, and that gave them fides martial reputation that they had suffered along with their men. That was one of the ingredients that explains one of many, their rise to power. But it was also important to understand that they viewed World War II as a corporal does the trenches. They were not, they had no experience like Roosevelt as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, as Churchill, as First Lord of the Admiralty, as Stalin, as a regional commissar in charge of military affairs. They were not administrators, they were not strategists. And so they kept, in times of peril or in extremis, they would say, I did this in the trenches, that just tell the soldiers, just tell Graziani in North Africa, he can go on the offensive. Just tell those commanders, if they're cold and it's wintry and they're icy outside of Leningrad, just dig a hole in the ice like I did. And that was a very short-sighted way of command. They also were ideologues. So whereas the British, were parliamentarians and they had an empire, they were imperialists, the Americans were democratic and often, I guess, nation builders, perhaps naive. Their ideology did not cloud their strategic judgment, at least to the degree that it was true of Hitler and Mussolini. So when German generals quite carefully, matter-of-factly would apprise Hitler of a looming disaster in North Africa in 1943, or a looming disaster of the Sixth Army, the response of Hitler and to a lesser extent Mussolini to his generals in the Balkans or North Africa was always emotional. It was not rational. And unlike the Allied leaders that increasingly entrusted military decisions and delegated them to a professional military class, Mussolini and Hitler took more of the decisions upon themselves, and they were really unqualified to do so. In the case of the Japanese, General Tojo, who took over in 41 and was a military staffer, he didn't have a lot of combat experience. He'd only been in the United States on a brief train ride. He had some administrative experience in China, but he was a glorified clerk. And his greatest concern was the Japanese army. And once he understood that Germany was probably going to take Russia when Japanese declared war on us on December 7th, the German army was right outside the suburbs of Moscow. So they felt, well, the Japanese army is not really needed in Russia, and the Russians are going to fall, and we have a non-aggression pact with them. And anyway, the Germans kind of double-crossed us when they invaded Russia when not telling us, and then earlier they cut their own non-aggression pact when we were fighting the Russians. So let's just keep out of Russia, and let's let the Navy, which is up to Western standards of technology and organization and command, and our Air Force that has planes that are comparable to or superior to America, let them take the forefront and we'll concentrate on China. And that was pretty much Tojo's strategy. It was pretty good, except for the main error that he outsourced the decision to attack Pearl Harbor to Admiral Yamamoto, who deserves a little footnote here. We in the United States sort of glorify Yamamoto, as we do a lot of Japanese commanders. Many of them were poets, they wrote haiku, they were artists, they had been in the United States. Yamamoto had been in the United States for 2 years as a military attaché. We sometimes forget that familiarity, as we saw after 9/11 with the United States or Western society in general, does not breed or does not create sympathy, but sometimes either envy or jealousy or disgust. So when Yamamoto came back, he didn't just say, I can cause havoc for 6 months, but then the United States will wake up as a sleeping dragon. He also said they were kind of decadent people, and if you don't let me attack Pearl Harbor, I'm going to quit. And when he was lost in 1943 to an American airborne assassination hit, it wasn't necessarily good for the United States, because when you look at Coral Sea and Midway, those decisions that Yamamoto made were in our favor. He was not a very competent admiral, despite his sterling reputation. When we look at all of the subordinate commanders, the generals, the admirals, there are certain consistencies, or at least stereotypes and generalizations that we can make. In general, the United States had two types of officer. There was the sober and judicious strategic planner and competent general in the field, and by that I mean George Marshall, Admiral Leahy, Admiral King, and Hap Arnold. Those four warlords pretty much created the strategic policy that at the end of the war was seen to be the right one, and their manner of command and organization was reflected by similarly sober and judicious officers like Admiral Spruance, Admiral Nimitz, especially Dwight Eisenhower, field marshals like General Hodges or General Bradley. And they were sort of the competent people that ensured that we were not going to lose the war. But there were other mercurial, wild-eyed, and brilliant people that are often caricatured in peacetime, but during the Caldwell War, we sort of brought them out of the closet. And I'm thinking here of a fiery Bull Halsey in the Pacific, Admiral Halsey, or a great Air Force leader like Curtis LeMay, or a brilliant Jimmy Doolittle, and especially a George Patton. These were colorful characters. They were always wanting to go on the offensive. They were imaginative. And without them, I don't think we would have won the war in 4 years. And then more importantly, below them at the 2- and 3-star level, when you look at Troy Middleton or Lucian Truscott or Terry Mesa Allen or Maxwell Taylor, or Lightning Joe Collins, we had brilliant commanders that came out of the Naval and Army War Colleges in the 1930s. And these were mostly people from small town America, very pragmatic, very smart guys who had advanced on the basis of merit. And if you look at any military at the 2- and 3-star levels, the Americans were very blessed. When you look at the Germans, we talk about Prussian excellence, and it's quite true that the German Army, especially the German Army, more so than the Air Force or the Navy, at the top level, and by that I would mean General Guderian, von Lieb, von Kleist, Walter Model, Heinrichsee, people like Erwin Rommel were superb, but superb in the sense of tactically superb. But when it came to strategic decisions, and by that I mean, should Rommel be given 2 or 3 more divisions on the eve of Barbarossa so that he can go into Egypt and take Suez, rather than, do we really need 200 divisions when we could do 180 and give Rommel 4 or 5 or 10? They made the wrong decision. Should we fight on the beaches with the Panzers to oppose the D-Day landings, or should we use a reserve? They couldn't really make a decision, and so they did both. When the Allies were going into Europe, should we make strongholds at places along the Atlantic ports, or should we withdraw? In other words, should we let Germans be surrounded and then hole up in the port and destroy the port, but lose 500,000 key troops? They made the wrong decision. Should we have a Battle of the Bulge or Ardennes offensive? They made the wrong decision. And by that wrong decision, I mean even commanders who knew what was the right thing to do, take Leningrad very quickly, avoid Stalingrad, cut the Volga River, and keep going to the Caucasus, or do not divert Army Group Center to the Kiev pocket, but go straight to Moscow in August, or better yet, not invade the Soviet Union at all. There were generals that saw that, but they either felt that it was not in their Prussian tradition to object to the Hitler and the high command, or they felt that it was quite dangerous to do so. And just a footnote, when you look at the military advisors around Hitler, and you compare them with Alan Brooke or George Marshall that were around, respectively, Churchill and Roosevelt, this is where the Axis were extremely wanting. And by that I mean Alfred Jodl, our General Keitel, our General Villemont were yes men. They were not the type of personalities to say to Hitler, we can't do that. I'll give you one example. On December 8th, these generals called each other up and said, has anybody heard of Pearl Harbor? And people said no. And he said, well, Hitler, the Japanese just attacked Pearl Harbor, and Hitler in 2 days is going to declare war on the United States. Why is he doing that? And then they started fighting, and they said, we didn't know he was going to do it. What's the purpose of it? And the purpose apparently was that Admiral Dönitz said, you know what, my submariners, my U-boaters can starve out of England now if they can hit American shipping off the coast of the United States. But nobody asked, well, how many subs do we have? And the answer was less than 50 in the Atlantic at that time, or 60, and that could actually patrol the American coast. So there was no organization, and there were no brilliant strategists of the type that could stand up to Hitler. If the Second World War was ultimately a story of people, how people died, and how people made decisions that determined which side won or lost, I think we can sum it up by the results, because the proof of the pudding is always in the eating. And when we look at this vast canvas of death that was the Second World War, 65 million people, and we see where they died and why they died and how they died, we have to ask ourselves, why was it that the United States and the British Empire, especially the United Kingdom on the British Isles, why was it that they were fundamental in defeating Germany, Italy, and Japan, and they came into the war late and largely unprepared, and yet after doing so, they were able to be the arsenals of democracy, to supply the superior air and naval power necessary to keep the Soviet Union in the war, and in a war that they had neither colluded actively with the Axis, and they had not been the Axis. They were not the aggressors. If they were guilty of anything, it was naivete. But that said, why were they able to be so successful in the war and yet lose less than 900,000 people, which is about the death toll at a major battle on the Eastern Front? Why was it? And I think the answer is twofold. One, the United States and the British Empire, or at least Great Britain itself, operated on a more meritocratic, not that they were completely meritocratic, but they were more transparent and more meritocratic, and they were able to draw talent. They didn't have people surrounding the supreme commander like Hermann Goering, who was a buffoonish incompetent by 1939, or Joseph Goebbels, or Heinrich Himmler, or Count Ciano, or General Graziani in Italy, or people like Tojo, or Misoka, or Yamamoto. In other words, they were able to get talented people to surround them, and they themselves had an overarching principle that they were going to find ways to win the war and to wage it with the least possible injury to their own country's populations. And that was completely diametrically opposed to the Axis powers' war of aggression, where they thought that we're super people, we're going to destroy inferiors, and if we lose people, it's a glorious thing to die during a war. Or in the Soviet Union's idea that all that matters is survival of the Soviet state. Millions do not matter if the Soviet principle, the Soviet project survives. Ultimately, then, the story of people turns out to be the brilliance of Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt in leading the democracies not just to war, but to a victorious war, and at very little cost in comparison to the other belligerents. We've seen how people made a great difference, and maybe perhaps the difference in World War II, but in the next lecture, we need to sum up all of these lectures. We haven't discussed how World War II ended, who really won the strategic verdict, and what was the aftermath like to each particular country, and especially in the 75 years that have occurred since the surrender of Japan and Germany and Italy.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Hillsdale Online Courses podcast. If you want to continue learning about World War II or other topics, please visit hillsdale.edu/course. There you can find over 40 free online courses, including American Citizenship and Its Decline with Victor Davis Hanson, C.S. Lewis on Christianity, Ancient Christianity, The Rise and Fall of the Roman Republic, and many more. The courses include additional readings, study guides, fully produced videos, and you can chat with your fellow students on a dedicated forum. Upon completing a course, you will also get a certificate. All our courses are free because we believe that a virtuous citizen is the best defense for liberty. So pursue the education necessary for freedom and happiness at hillsdale.edu/course today. That's hillsdale.edu/course. Thanks for listening.